Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
While it is Thanksgiving week, it certainly has not been slow in terms of news flow. Much coming from the president-elect Donald Trump, including last night his threat on Truth Social to impose higher tariffs on the U.S.'s three largest trading partners, 25% on all goods coming from Mexico and Canada, and an additional 10% on all goods from China. The president-elect says this is necessary to clamp down on migrants and illegal drugs like fentanyl coming over the U.S. border. And keep in mind here, he had floated tariffs much higher than this during the course of his presidential campaign. He threw 60% out there for China. So we want to turn now to someone who focuses on China extensively in the House of Representatives by sitting on the House China Select Committee. Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts is here with me now on Bloomberg TV and radio. Congressman, thanks for your time. As we consider the authority Donald Trump would use to do this, if he indeed follows through on this threat, it really is about protecting U.S. national security interest in large part. Is this a justified means to an end?
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me on. Before we talk about the politics and the legality, I think it's helpful to start with the facts of the matter. I'm the co-chair of the Fentanyl Working Group. I'm on the Joint Task Force for combating the Mexican drug cartel. So I've been able to see both sides of this problem. And the facts are this. The Chinese are exporting about 97% of all fentanyl precursors to either the west coast of Mexico, where it then gets channeled into the United States, or directly to the United States. It's causing about 100,000 American deaths every year, about a 9/11 every week. The Mexican drug cartels are absolutely part of this supply chain, both through trafficking and also through money laundering. And yes, as the Mexican president said, they are also being equipped by U.S. arms sales going to the south. So there are no clean hands in this problem. But what is for certain is that Donald Trump's knee-jerk approach to using tariffs right off the bat does two things. One, it removes his most potent leverage, as opposed to using an escalatory ladder, starting with other more targeted reprisals to Chinese exports. And two, it's going to raise prices on Americans. It's going to raise prices on Americans for car insurance, for housing, and it's also going to compress wages for American employees who are working for companies that now have smaller end markets.
Okay, well, so if we consider that then, this notion that these things do need to be calibrated, is there a level of tariff you think would be appropriate to put in place to use as leverage to get more favorable outcomes when it comes to the flow of things over the U.S. border, both people and illegal drugs, as Donald Trump suggests? Or is this not the right way of approaching this policy?
Putting tariffs on the table as negotiating leverage is not a bad idea. And by the way, Donald Trump didn't invent that. I know he likes to claim that he's the person who thought of the idea of mutual market access being a negotiating tactic. He's not. U.S. trade representatives have been using that for time immemorial. Here's the more targeted approach, though. There's about 24 Chinese manufacturers who account for the vast majority of these fentanyl active pharmaceutical ingredients. And these Chinese manufacturers actually have a lot of licit business as well as illicit business. That means they are highly susceptible to sanctions. So step number one is the United States needs to impose and draconiously enforce very tough sanctions on Chinese chemical manufacturers that are shipping fentanyl. Number two, we should be charging docking fees on Chinese ships coming to ports, and we can escalate those docking fees until they get better screening and customs process on their end. We can also establish a joint task force counter-opioid that would fuse together various organs of U.S. state power, intelligence, law enforcement, customs, immigration, to targeting fentanyl shipments into the United States, whether by air or by sea. And finally, we should totally get rid of the de minimis exemption that Chinese, both licit and illicit manufacturers, have been abusing to ship in projects to the United States. All of these things that I just said don't raise the price of car insurance for the average American family, don't raise the price of housing for the average American family, but they still get the point across to China.
Well, and many of those things you just said also involve other cabinet officials, presumably, or other departments at the very least. Treasury for the enforcement of sanctions, tariffs, obviously, there as well. The Secretary of State potentially to handle with the diplomacy aspects. And when we consider the individuals that the president-elect has selected for those posts, does that give you more confidence about the way China policy is going to be approached under this administration?
Well, as I look at the opioid epidemic cascading over the United States, and then I look at the nominee for Health and Human Services Secretary, no, that doesn't fill me with confidence, because he starts by looking at problems from a position of conspiracy, not from a position of science. RFK is somebody who doesn't believe that AIDS is caused by a virus. He thinks that high-speed internet causes leaky brain syndrome. He thinks that COVID was ethnically targeted to spare Jews and Chinese and target Black Americans. So this is not an individual that I trust to look at the evidence and take a rational and science-informed view of how we reduce opioid deaths and how we tackle fentanyl imports to the United States. But this is why it is so critical that Congress mandate a joint task force counter opioid that brings together all the various elements of U.S. state power and makes fentanyl a priority. Because there's really two short-term things that we want from China, in my opinion. One, stop exporting fentanyl to the United States. And two, stop importing Iranian oil that is funding these proxy terror groups in the Middle East. We can accomplish those two things in the first year, but not if Donald Trump punishes American citizens with higher prices as opposed to punishing China.
Well, I'm glad, Congressman, that you raised the Middle East, because we're watching that as well today. In fact, any minute now, we're expecting we will hear from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as we've been made to understand both by Israeli officials, but even the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken as well, that a ceasefire agreement with Lebanon, or with Hezbollah in Lebanon, is within reach. We've talked to you extensively about the conflict between Israel and these proxies on this program, Congressman. How do you feel about the prospects of this being done, and what it might mean for a potential ceasefire in Gaza as well?
We should be cautious that they are distinct issues. What's going to be critical for any ceasefire agreement with Hezbollah, in my view, is that these Israelis who have been displaced from their homes and communities in northern Israel because of indiscriminate Hezbollah rocket fire need to be able to return back to their homes. And we also need to see that Hezbollah is not going to relocate to the southern border of Lebanon and be able to continue their launching of precision-guided munitions, but rather that the Lebanese army will gain operational control of that area so that the 2006 agreement can really be honored, which is that there needs to be that buffer zone. Gaza really remains a separate issue, and I think we should be cautious about interlocking them too much. Of course, every ceasefire agreement is progress, but in Gaza, it still comes down to those hostages. We have human beings held underground in terror tunnels, and they need to be released home. And Israel has every right to continue to operate against Hamas until those hostages are home.
Well, and we know that's something that the president has been advocating for the last year or more, Congressman. He has 55 days left to go before Donald Trump takes over. What would it mean if some form of ceasefire agreement, at least a greater degree of peace in the Middle East, can be achieved before President Biden leaves office?
Every president has aspired to that since Jimmy Carter and onwards, right? So of course every president views that as a golden ring to burnish their legacy. What would be really critical for Joe Biden, I think, is a hostage deal for Gaza that got these hostages home, and that also transitioned towards Palestinian-led, Arab-financed, Western-backed reconstruction of Gaza that respects Israel's security. That is the pinnacle of a Israel-Gaza accord. I think the second thing that he can do within these next 55 days is enforce the oil export sanctions against Iran with more muscle and vigor. Iran is exporting about 90% of its oil to China, and it's using that hard currency, one, to keep its own regime afloat, but two, to fund these proxy terror groups across the Middle East. And what we saw with Israel's attack against Iran is that Iran is significantly more vulnerable now than it was even 6 months ago. And I think when it's in a position of weakness is when you want to pounce.
All right, Congressman, thank you so much for joining me. Congressman Jake Auchincloss, the Democrat from Massachusetts.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has just begun his televised remarks. We'll, of course, bring you the headlines from this as we get them, but we want to add the voice as we await the news here of Evelyn Farkas. She is executive director of the McCain Institute, joining us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Evelyn, as we await the words of Netanyahu and clarity as to whether or not an agreement has been reached, the reporting suggests that this would be temporary, 60-day ceasefire. How, if it is agreed to, do you make 60 days something more permanent?
Kailey, thank you for having me on. I think it needs to be really considered what kind of armed force might be in there to reinforce this agreement, because if there's no enforcement, I'm afraid the agreement won't hold. And there have been various proposals. Perhaps the IDF could go in there. It would, of course, require the United Nations to agree to that, which is a difficult proposition right now, given the perspective that a lot of the United Nations members have on Israel and the Israeli Defense Forces, how they have been fighting in Gaza.
Well, Netanyahu is speaking, as we mentioned, Evelyn, in Hebrew, we understand. But initially, the first read of his comments in part say that he says, the war will not end until residents can return to the north and all goals are accomplished, including that safe return. And it does raise the question of the goals Israel had here at the outset, Evelyn, and to what extent they have been largely achieved. And that doesn't just go for in Lebanon, but in Gaza as well.
Well, I think, Kailey, clearly the Israeli government has managed to neutralize Hezbollah as a threat. And in doing so, it has significantly weakened Iran, leaving aside, of course, or let's add to it, what Israel has done in Gaza and what Israel has done directly in Iran. So Iran is much weakened. So there is an opportunity now to put pressure on Iran to make a bigger deal, meaning to stop the fighting through the power they have over Hamas in Gaza. And there's an opportunity to maybe get Iran's nuclear, program back in the box, if you will.
Yeah, and Netanyahu is now saying that he's determined to prevent Iran from having nuclear arms. So we're talking about the same thing here, Evelyn. And I do wonder the role you think Iran has in the knowledge that it is going to take Iranian blessing, you would think, or at least allowance of its proxy, Hezbollah, to agree to a deal like this with Israel if one is to be reached. I wonder what it signals to you, knowing that their proxies have been weakened, if Iran is going to sanction this.
Yeah, I think Iran probably doesn't have a choice. Hezbollah is significantly weakened. They probably want a break, if you will, a break from the fighting. My guess is that Hezbollah would probably be itching or would be willing to conduct more attacks against Israel in the future. That's why I think there needs to be some kind of mechanism for enforcement. But I don't think Iran has much of a choice. If Hezbollah says we can't hold out, and if Iran wants to take some of the pressure off of itself, again, minimize the likelihood that Israel might do something further to further weaken Iran, whether it's in their nuclear facilities or elsewhere, I think Iran might be feeling like this is a good deal for the moment.
Well, and Iran also knows, as does Israel and Netanyahu, as do the Iranian proxies, that 55 days from now, there will be a different U.S. administration in place. Donald Trump will be the president and commander-in-chief. And I wonder the extent to which, Evelyn, you think that is factoring in to the timing of this, as it's been months of pushing for a deal like this one. And now 3 weeks after the election, it does seem like it could come to fruition.
Yeah, I think Iran is definitely concerned about what will happen under a U.S. government led by President Trump. We know from media accounts that Iran tried to assassinate him, so they clearly didn't want him to be our next president. They are worried about this because Donald Trump has taken a hard line against Iran. So I would think that they're eager to have this deal. The Israelis, I think, would be more likely to drag this out and offer a peace agreement, even if it's temporary, with Hezbollah as a gift to incoming President Trump. So I'm a little bit skeptical, Kailey, that this is going to get signed before the inauguration on January 20th.
Okay, so and it is worth pointing out as we're if you're with us here on Bloomberg TV, you see that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is still speaking. We have yet to see him specifically address a ceasefire or to hear from him on that. We're still waiting for that news, Evelyn, but 55 days, I guess, is not that long of a time. And what the question I started with, this notion that it could be a 60-day cessation of hostilities window, that would essentially bring us, 5 days in to a Trump presidency? How could that play in here? They'll say, we'll pause things for now, but when Trump comes back, we're revisiting this.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. And maybe Israel thinks that they'll be in a better position then. I think they will be, frankly, given the relationship between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump. So that is another option. They could sign now. And then, as you point out, I hadn't done the math, then the gift to President Trump is a chance to revisit and chance to make another deal.
Well, we just heard from Netanyahu saying the duration of the truce in Lebanon depends on developments. He says if Hezbollah chooses to rearm, then Israel will attack once again. As we consider here, Evelyn, this notion that things can be temporary or they could be longer in duration depending on the decisions here of the Iranian proxies. You were just speaking about this notion that they have been materially weakened, commanders taken out, infrastructure targeted by Israeli strikes. How long realistically would it take Hezbollah to reconstitute themselves, to be in the position to be as great a threat to Israel as it was beginning on October 8th and through now?
It's hard for me to say. That's really kind of a military question. Clearly, they lost a lot of manpower. The people whose hands were blown off, they are not likely to be fighters, so they need to be replaced. They need to replace their weaponry because, of course, we know Israel has taken out large stockpiles, all the places where Hezbollah had kept their weapons. Those have been eliminated. I don't think it takes that long, so probably maybe 6 months to a year. So this is a window of opportunity for Israel, certainly, and I would imagine that the Iranians and Hezbollah would be interested in, quickly going to a ceasefire so that they can take advantage and try to rebuild.
And just again, reminding our audience that on Bloomberg TV and radio that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is speaking, suggesting now that he will be bringing a truce agreement in Lebanon to the cabinet for cabinet approval, which, of course, we understood that the cabinet was meeting today. So that might suggest this has not been fully agreed to yet. Evelyn, we also thought we might hear from President Biden today. I suppose we still could before he travels to Nantucket for Thanksgiving. And that plays into the fact that it was not just the U.S. at the table here in these negotiations. In part, this agreement was negotiated with the help of France, and French President Emmanuel Macron, we understand, was involved here. What do you make of the role of another ally, another mediating force in this, knowing, of course, that there were many mediators at play in the talks that have yet to come to a fruitful ceasefire deal when it comes to Israel and Hamas?
Yeah, it is interesting that the French were involved. Of course, the French have a long history in and with Lebanon, and so they want to maintain their relevance in the Middle East. So I would imagine that was part of what was motivating France. But clearly, they would also like to, tamp down the danger that we're going to have a wider war in the Middle East involving Iran and Israel continuing to target one another directly. That's dangerous for the world, frankly. And so I think France was motivated to try to help us with the diplomacy. The Lebanese government, of course, is also involved because the United States, we don't deal directly with Hezbollah because they're a terrorist organization. So the Lebanese government was essentially doing some of that go-between work.
Well, that is an important point. There's obviously a distinction between the Lebanese government and Hezbollah forces. To reiterate, Netanyahu here is saying that he will bring the Lebanon truce agreement to the Security Cabinet for a vote, suggesting that vote has not happened yet, though he does say the truce proposed will help isolate Hamas and free hostages. We also just had a headline cross the Bloomberg terminal that 10 minutes from now, at least scheduled 10 minutes from now at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time, Biden will be delivering remarks at the White House. I would presume, Evelyn, those remarks would pertain to this. Just before I let you go, knowing he is in the final weeks here of his presidency with just 55 days to go, as we've discussed, what would it mean if this can be achieved under this president in particular, who has been pushing for a ceasefire and said he wants part of his legacy to be greater peace in the Middle East?
Well, it would mean that he has achieved, of course, that objective, and he will have brought some peace to the Middle East in the aftermath of the horrible attack that was, conducted by Lebanese proxies by Hamas out of Gaza. And then, of course, the fact that the Hezbollah struck Israel again, the first time since, in a massive way since the 2006 negotiations to end the conflict between Hezbollah and Israel in the north. So it would be an achievement, certainly, that would bring us closer to, it'll bring some peace and it'll allow the Israeli people to go back and live in the north, and also the Lebanese people to live in their south. But it wouldn't solve the Hamas. It might make it easier to solve Hamas, but those are very different situations. So I'm a bit skeptical as to whether that would open the door wide enough.
All right, Evelyn, appreciate you joining us as we work through these headlines from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Assemble our signature political panel. Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner and Bloomberg Politics contributor. Also Bloomberg Politics contributor Jeanne Zaino, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Jeanne, I'd like to ask you the same question I just asked Evelyn. As we consider here a U.S. president in his final weeks as commander-in-chief, final weeks in the Oval Office, what would it mean for President Biden if indeed a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah is reached while he still holds that title?
Yeah, it would be enormously important for President Biden. This is something he has been committed to, as Evelyn mentioned, since the October 7th horrific attack. He went right over to Israel. He is obviously a great friend of Israel, and so he would like to see this happen. That said, history doesn't sort of suggest that he should be incredibly optimistic, because Middle East peace has been one of the most confounding things for presidents in the modern era to get and to achieve. And they've all tried, left, right, and center, Republican, Democrat, very hard to get to. To hear Netanyahu say that he has an outline, or there is an outline that the French and the U.S. diplomats were able to negotiate, and he's bringing it to the cabinet. I just keep wondering, in the back of Joe Biden's mind, is he thinking he is the next Jimmy Carter with the Iran hostages, that he is going to work this hard and Donald Trump will come in and on January 21st, we will see an agreement? It's hard to say, but that's got to be weighing in the back of his mind. It's going to be curious to see how he handles this when he speaks in a couple minutes.
Yeah, and we actually do have a correction here on the timeline. He'll be speaking now at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time from the Rose Garden at the White House. So just over 1 hour from now is when we expect those remarks. Rick, I'd love for you to weigh in on this kind of legacy shaping question as well, because we all remember when President Biden came into office, he was suggesting America's back. He made foreign policy a really key pillar of his presidency. Is it going to end on a foreign policy oriented note?
Well, I think certainly foreign policy is going to be one of the things that shapes Joe Biden's legacy. Starting with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, a horrific outcome for him, and something that actually hurt his standing amongst the American people, that sort of lasted all the way through to the election. But then, the vexing war in Ukraine. And even though Many observers will say that Joe Biden's been a staunch advocate and supporter of Ukraine and fighting the war of Russian aggression. There are just as many who will say he hasn't done enough quick enough to really end the war, but has now resulted in a prolonged conflict with no end in sight. And to some degree, this whole Israeli situation, you take it from the time that he got elected and that everyone was celebrating the Abraham Accords. People in his own administration were saying, this is a peaceful situation in the Middle East, could last for a long time. And then it was just after that, of course, Israel got the worst attack in their history, from Hamas and lit up this war that we're now talking about. So, yeah, this is definitely going to frame the foreign policy legacy of Joe Biden. And frankly, difficult to find real successes inside that legacy. And so on the domestic side, totally different equation, has done a lot to get us out of COVID and restore the economic health of our country. But on foreign policy, national security, I think it's going to be a spotty legacy, at least, and unless we see how all this unwinds itself.
Well, and to that point, Jeanne, as we consider the domestic legacy, foreign policy as well, how much of it, even as it stands now and when he leaves office, could be unwound over the course of the next 4 years when Donald Trump gets his turn again?
Yeah, that's the big fear of every president, and it is absolutely possible. As we think about Joe Biden talking at 2:30 or when he comes out, I'm reminded that he was at the G20 and he did not speak to the press for like almost a week. And so, it's unclear how he is going to move forward with his attempts to protect his legacy. And the efforts are widespread because, as you mentioned, as it comes to regulations, they started in February and March trying to protect those against a potential Republican takeover, which has now happened. As you think about legislation, just think about the CHIPS Act, huge success for the Biden administration and the Democrats in Congress. And yet about 30 billion of that has not been spent yet. And, it could be an issue of them running out of time. And Rick was just talking about the policy legacy. So you look at this, and he does have a lot of work to do to try to cement this legacy. And one thing we know that's happening in Congress right now is the Senate is rushing as far as it can to confirm the rest of these judges because the Democrats will lose the Senate. All of this impacting Joe Biden's legacy. So it is a broad legacy. And of course, Donald Trump, he is, the Democrats and Joe Biden are firmly convinced he might do what he did in 2017 and use the Congressional Review Act to unwind some of this and in EOs. And that's very, very possible. So it is a challenge for them.
Well, and something else President Biden has focused on is lowering the cost of prescription drugs. And we actually have a new proposal on that from the administration just today, Jeanne, proposing a rule that would require both Medicare and Medicaid to cover obesity drugs, the weight loss drugs we all have heard so much about in recent years. The White House says this will give more than 7 million people access to weight loss treatment, but it also could add potentially $40 billion in costs over 10 years in the process for these programs. So clearly he's trying to lower more prescription drug costs, Jeanne, but does he still have time for it to do so, to make this a reality?
Yeah. And that was one of his big accomplishments was the lowering of drug prices. They announced this, as you mentioned, the last 24 hours, but they may, again, to your point, run out of time. They also have to be cognizant that if we see, say, RFK Jr. approved as HHS secretary, while he seems firmly and has spoken a lot about, better eating, exercise, and health, he has not been the biggest fan of these so-called, weight loss drugs and prescription drugs. And so they have to understand that this could be reversed, pulled back by the next administration, particularly if they don't move with all deliberate speed. So they're trying to move in this direction, but they've only got about a month left to get this all in place.
Well, and I wonder to what extent they might be rushing to get this into place, Rick, not just for legacy protection purposes, but also proofing purposes, if you will. If Biden is trying to make some health policy oriented decisions here at the end of his term before, say, RFK Jr. takes the helm at Health and Human Services.
Yeah, I actually don't think they have time. There are certain prescriptions to advertise these changes to Medicare and Medicaid, and they've just announced it. So it runs its course, which won't be over until after the inaugural. So this will fall into the category of things that the Trump administration will pick up. And look, there's a lot of dissidence within that administration on approaches, especially when it comes to Medicare and Medicaid. I mean, you've got Dr. Oz, who famously on his TV shows promoted weight loss drugs and their effect on all range of things. And so the reality is, what may hold for Bobby Kennedy might not be the same point of view as the person who's now in charge of running those programs, Dr. Oz. And of course, all of this will probably fall under the prescription, so to speak, of President Trump, who I think is probably much more populistic. And attitude is, if people want their drugs, we should give them to them. And so I think that this is going to be a administration that makes decisions out of the White House, and they will be implemented in their agencies, not the other way around.
Well, Jeanne, I wonder if you agree with that, as we've talked about all of these various cabinet level selections and otherwise we've gotten from Donald Trump the degrees to which they will have influence on policy. If is it that shapes policy, the White House approves it, or the White House originates it and everybody else just has to act on that desire?
I think what we're seeing clearly from what Donald Trump campaigned on and the folks that are in the cabinet, provided they're all confirmed, is that there is a real desire to move this all under the auspices of the White House. You look at Boyd, you look at others, they're very, very clear that there is no independent agents anymore. There's no independent departments in their view. They want and have a firm view of strong executive power that they would like to ensure is in the federal government in a way they don't feel it has been for several decades, if ever. And so I think their view is to give Donald Trump and the White House the power and to allow the president to do what he thinks is in his best interest. As it concerns this particular weight loss drug, I don't personally recall Donald Trump speaking out about it. But the reality is there are different views in this cabinet. And if RFK is appointed HHS secretary, he may not take as kindly to this as a Dr. Oz or even the Surgeon General, who's a fascinating woman and a fascinating doctor if she's approved. So, there's a lot of different views, and it's partly going to depend on how Donald Trump sees this. And of course, the costs of all of this.
Well, and of course, it also depends on if these individuals do get that approval from the Senate, Rick. Nothing is done until it's really done when it comes to this transition process and these nominees becoming confirmees or officially being confirmed for their roles.
That's right. And that could take a while, right? We know that it's taken some time in his first administration, although he's ahead of schedule at naming these individuals. None of them have been through proper background checks, and the vetting process hasn't even really begun on Capitol Hill in the Senate. So it could take a while. Maybe some will get through quickly. I don't know about how the Senate Committee on Health is going to work as far as bringing up these nominees, but it's going to be a high priority of this administration in the first quarter of this year, but we could be still talking about this in March.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, I look forward to talking about this with you in March and in the months in between, our signature political panel here on Balance of Power. Thank you so much. And as we are here on Balance of Power, I would remind you that we have been dealing with some breaking news in the last several minutes, having just heard from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who in part said that he will be bringing a ceasefire deal in Lebanon, that agreement, to his security cabinet for approval this evening. So we're awaiting the actual vote on that. But Netanyahu said the duration of the ceasefire depends on what happens in Lebanon.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Just 3 weeks later, Donald Trump is seeming like he wants to make good on promises made on the campaign trail, including those around tariffs. Taking to True Social last night, suggesting he would put into place an additional 10% tariff on all goods coming from China and 25% on those coming from Mexico and Canada. The president-elect suggesting that this needs to be done in order to clamp down on migrants and illegal drugs like fentanyl coming over the U.S. border. It's unclear whether this is just a negotiating tact, though, and we should keep in mind that he had actually floated tariffs even higher than this over the course of his campaign. At one point, he was suggesting 60% levies placed on all Chinese goods, a level that our own economists here at Bloomberg think would effectively cut off trade between the world's two largest economies. It is, though, a reminder, of course, that what you do economically does have implications geopolitically. And that's where we really want to focus now with our first guest. Michael O'Hanlon is with me. He is Brookings Institution Senior Fellow and Director of Research in the Foreign Policy Program. Michael, welcome back to Balance of Power. When we first consider the authority Trump could use to do this, what powers are bestowed upon him and the executive branch? Many of those things stem from national security interests, basically that the president can impose higher tariffs if they think it is necessary to protect U.S. national security. Could that be adequate justification here?
You know, it's a great question. According to the letter of the law, I'm not going to claim expertise to be able to answer your question. According to the spirit of the law, the answer would be yes, if you're talking about fentanyl and Mexico. I'm not really sure what Mexico can do in any realistic way or time horizon to dramatically cut back on the illegal shipments of fentanyl to the United States. But it certainly is a national security consideration. I mean, when you have 100,000 Americans a year dying of opioid overdoses, I think that qualifies as a national security problem. And I don't think a court would be in a position to disagree, even if scholars might have a debate on that question. So in that sense, I think that it's plausible that both in regard to China with its power and its rise on the world stage and the military implications of China's growing economic power, as well as the fentanyl connection and the illegal immigration connection with Mexico, I think that Trump probably could invoke national security considerations, at least in a political and strategic sense. Whether the law and the lawyers would let him, I don't know.
Well, so if we focus on China here specifically, what could higher tariffs or greater trade barriers ultimately mean for the nature of the relationship with an adversary like that? Is it actually something that can be exercised as leverage to get more favorable outcomes geopolitically, or is it something that could potentially be even more destabilizing geopolitically and risk undoing progress made in normalization of ties between the U.S. and China?
Both. And hence the riskiness of the strategy. Although I think that to get concessions, you have to have a reasonable theory of the case for why the tariff is an appropriate policy tool. There has to be some sense of fair play or at least leverage. And I think that with Trump already having applied these high tariffs on China in his first term and President Biden having kept those in Biden's term, it's harder to see why a general sweeping tariff would be appropriate now. Obviously, we do have intellectual property right disagreements with China. We feel they steal a lot of our IPR. And we also have national security concerns over high technology. So I think on either of those two more limited bins of technology, you could imagine Trump making this threat and perhaps having some justification for doing so. And you could imagine that the response by China that we would want to achieve would be less theft of intellectual property and also less provocative behavior in the Western Pacific militarily. So in that sense, there'd be a credible, plausible linkage. But a 10% across the board tariff, I mean, it's harder for me to see how China reacts well to that. At least it's less than 60%, as you pointed out earlier. 10%, the news there is almost that Trump's so dramatically lowering the additional tariff that he said he was going to apply to goods from China. That's more the news in some sense than the additional proposal for 10% more. But the Chinese are still not going to be thrilled, obviously. And whether Trump could actually extract out less threatening behavior militarily out of China, that's pretty dubious. I do still like the idea of linkage because China should know that there are going to be economic repercussions to strategically destabilizing behavior. I'm just not sure you're really going to get a negotiation on those terms anytime soon.
Well, we'll see what happens, I suppose, when Trump actually takes office once again. Something that could happen more immediately than that, potentially as soon as today, Michael, is a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Lebanon. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is set to give a televised address less than an hour from now. There's been reports that President Biden may speak too, and Antony Blinken just said that the Lebanon ceasefire effort is near the finish line and could help end the conflict in Gaza as well. Even if this agreement is reached, Michael, do you believe it will stick and potentially have ramifications for beyond Lebanon, but into Israel's war with Hamas?
That's a great question. I think there's a good chance it could stick. Hezbollah, of course, has lost most of its leadership, so no one's quite sure who's calling the shots there and exactly how much control they have over the whole organization. So even if you get a deal, you could have some outliers who violate it on the Hezbollah side. But I think that on balance, Hezbollah still has demonstrated an ability to graduate, to adjust the level of its fire and the locations of its fire as a function of where things stand with Gaza, where things stand more broadly with Israel. And so I'm guessing they've still got enough command and control over their organization, irrespective of the loss of top leadership, that they probably could hew to such a ceasefire. And certainly Israel would relish that because it wants to be able to move back the tens of thousands of citizens who have had to evacuate northern Israel due to the previous year's attacks from Lebanese territory by Hezbollah against those locations in Israel. As to whether that could actually lead to a higher probability of a ceasefire in Gaza, I suppose in some broader political sense, because the atmosphere would have changed. I'm not sure, though, that it really changes the specific options Israel would think it has in Gaza. It certainly doesn't want to do a deal with Hamas itself, unless that deal also committed Hamas to no longer be in charge of Gaza longer term and to just have this be the step towards creation of a new political entity inside of the Palestinian territories. So if Hamas would agree to that deal, then maybe, but I don't know that Hamas would.
Well, and it's a question of what Israel is willing to agree to as well, considering from the very start of this conflict last October, they said their end goal was the total eradication of Hamas. Are we, though, coming to realize that at least from an ideology perspective, is not something that feasibly could have been accomplished?
I don't think it could be, but one of the smartest things I've seen written about this conflict in recent weeks was by Michael Duran of the Hudson Institute, who suggested that Israel's real goal was not so much a ceasefire with what's left of centralized Hamas leadership, but rather individual ceasefires with local leaders of Hamas in various parts of Gaza. And to the extent they could achieve that, maybe they could claim that was essentially a realization of their earlier promise to eradicate Hamas as a central organization, inside the Gaza Strip. That may be also unrealistic, but a little less unrealistic than completely eradicating every previous member of the organization.
And Michael, we have less than a minute left here, but how does the knowledge that Donald Trump will be the president 55 days from now influence all sides of these negotiations?
Well, I think that for Prime Minister Netanyahu, he will be happier with Trump than with Biden. And I don't know if that means that he really, therefore, is more likely to agree to a ceasefire. In other words, some people had the theory that Netanyahu wanted the war to be ongoing in a way that would hurt Biden and Harris politically. And now that that's over, the election is complete and Trump won, this same argument would no longer apply. But I doubt that was Netanyahu's main calculus from the start. So I don't think it changes that much.
All right, Michael O'Hanlon, Brookings Institution Senior Fellow and Director of Research in the Foreign Policy Program.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
As it was just last night that Donald Trump on Truth Social threatened to place higher tariffs on the U.S.'s three largest trading partners, an additional 10% tariff on all goods coming from China and 25% on those coming from Mexico and Canada. We want to talk more about the economic impact ultimately of levies of that kind, assuming that they do become reality and this isn't just a negotiating tactic, and turn to Christopher Smart. He is managing partner at Arbroath Group and former special assistant to President Barack Obama for international economics. Christopher, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. We've been debating all day whether this is a negotiating tactic or if it's real. If it is the latter, what would this do to the cost of goods in the U.S.?
Well, Kailey, great to be with you. And I think just listening to you talk to your colleagues a moment ago about President Biden trying to secure his legacy, set the agenda in foreign policy up until his last day in office. President Trump, at least on trade and immigration policy, has already seized control of those agendas. And I think loud and clear, he has broadcast his opening move in what is always a trade negotiation, whether you put on tariffs or not, or threaten to put on tariffs, it is intended at least to extract some sorts of concessions from trade partners. In this case, the surprise is that it has come now, I think. And the surprise is that, or what is not clear, is exactly what he hopes to get in return. I'll just say one quick thing. Framing it in terms of a national security threat, as the president-elect has done, I think gives him some leeway legally, at least, to impose tariffs without a lot of extra congressional authorities to do so. So that may be part of what he is thinking right now. What we don't really know is, again, what he hopes to secure.
Well, there's also the question of what the markets are thinking about all of this, because right now, Christopher, I'm looking at a fresh record high on the S&P 500. I would describe the general attitude today as pretty nonplussed. Is that appropriate?
Well, I was trying to do the joke about denial is not just a river in Egypt, but I think there is a sense in markets that because, again, this is something that is coming out 2 months before the president can do anything, and I think even then, I think he would issue an executive order, and it may take some time for those tariffs to take effect. We'll know much more in the next 2 months how Mexico, Canada, and China may respond to this. I think the fear for those of us who look at this from a longer term is that these are probably moving goalposts. And even if Ottawa, Mexico City, Beijing were able to satisfy the president's concerns, the president-elect's concerns right now on drugs and immigration, he's got a whole list of concerns that he is ready to come back to them with and use tariffs as leverage. So I would expect, these tariffs, at least in some form, to start getting phased in. Maybe not a blanket tariff the way he announced last night, but something is going to make trade with those countries more expensive, at least in certain industries, and probably we're in for a longer and more protracted set of negotiations.
Well, Christopher, it is last night that we learned about this new threat. We ended Monday with that after beginning Monday with the initial market welcoming with open arms of the selection of Scott Bessent for Treasury Secretary. What check on not just the tariff policy, but all of these kind of economic policy suggestions from the president-elect could Bessent actually be in this incoming administration?
Well, the president is the president, and the secretary is just the secretary. I think Scott Bessent is obviously a very experienced, market-savvy investor who can at least give the president advice on how markets will react to certain things that he is doing. And the president obviously does care about that because he talks about certainly the stock market as one of the measures of his success or the success of his presidency. So I'm sure that is part of it. One only wishes one could be in the room to know just how much Scott Bessent was part of this announcement, or whether, welcome to the team, this is our first move, and whether he's going to be trying to catch up with the president and the trade agenda. But we'll have to see how that plays out. As you recall, Secretary Mnuchin was a moderating impact on a lot of the trade tariff agenda in President Trump's first term.
There's also a question not just of the role Bessent will play in trade policy, but also what role, if any, he would play on applying pressure to the independent Federal Reserve, because he certainly has thoughts about that. In fact, he shared some with the host of Bloomberg Wall Street Week, David Weston, just this summer. Take a listen.
Let's go back to the original sin. The original sin in the independence of the Fed. Jay Powell's reappointment was the latest this century for a Fed chair, latest this century. And I think that is what stoked or certainly accelerated the inflation. At Jackson Hole, August 2021, you go back and read Jay Powell's speech, he knew inflation was hot. Biden administration did not announce his reappointment until November, so they had him under the thumb. Now, he could have been a good patriot and risked his job and started raising rates, but he didn't.
And that maybe gets best into this notion he's put forward of a shadow Fed chair. Christopher, all of it, though, as we're now less than 10 minutes away from the minutes of the Fed's latest meeting, raises the question on the trajectory of monetary policy as we move forward into the next 4 years.
Yeah, and I think Scott Bessent has backed away a little bit from those remarks since then. Obviously very concerning for those who want the Fed's independence to be protected and reinforced. And I think most independent investors, certainly global investors, expect that to continue. And I think it's also worth giving him the benefit of the doubt to actually be enshrined as Treasury Secretary and to reiterate his views on that question. I think once you are in office and you have those responsibilities, you may not be, you'll feel a little bit more constrained about what you want to say about the Fed. Once people start feeling like you have influence over the Fed's policy, then you also become responsible for it. And I think that's part of the double-edged sword of Fed independence. If they get things wrong, you can disown them while it is going wrong until it gets back on track. So we'll watch that story play out. My expectation is once he gets into office, he'll play a much more conventional role, given his experience with markets. But we'll be watching that one closely.
Well, and the Fed gets to make one more rate decision before Donald Trump takes office. There's a decision coming up in just a few weeks, Christopher, and a lot of people are looking to the minutes we're about to get as a signal potentially on what that move is going to be. As we await them, what will you be looking for? And what's your call on December right now?
Well, I think my call in December would be another 25 basis points. I think it would be a little bit odd for them to stop now. And it might start looking a little bit political if they're looking ahead. They say they don't, and I believe that they don't. But if they were to sort of start front-running potential legislative changes, tax changes next year, and pausing on their rate cut path, I think one more this year probably gives them a little bit of room to pause going into next year. In terms of the minutes, Kailey, with all due respect, this seems, the minutes story is one of the least interesting ones to me as somebody who watches the Fed. I mean, it's 2-week-old news about people talking about 2-month-old data. And so I'm not sure it really gives us a whole lot of insight into what the Fed's going to do this time around. And certainly that plus President Biden's Rose Garden announcement is going to overshadow anything that might come out in the minutes.
You're sounding suspiciously like my colleague, Tom Keene, who has some pretty choice thoughts on the Fed minutes every time they come out. Christopher, I'm glad, though, you raised that we are expecting. It is a compliment. It is intended as one. But you raised the fact that we are expecting to hear from President Biden just over half an hour from now, speaking from the Rose Garden. We expect that may pertain to what's going on in the Middle East and relate to foreign policy. But it's also a reflection on this is a president now reflecting on his legacy with just 55 days left to go in office. When you consider his economic legacy, Christopher, how would you describe it?
Well, I think it's obviously going to be shaped by people's views of inflation, and the loss of this election by the Democratic nominee is directly related to those higher prices. But I think if you take it back to look at the context of what he has done, both in the moment cyclically to dig us out of the hole from the COVID pandemic, but also to structurally put in place policies that reinforce fill, if you will, market failures around climate development, around technology, innovation, around our supply of chips in the United States. I think that will reflect very well on his legacy when historians look back. This is a moment where he really has invested in the next stage of U.S. economic growth. And in spite of what inflation is and people feel it to be, inflation has actually been coming down, as you know. It's just not necessarily reflected in what voters see at the store.
Christopher Smart, thank you for joining me here on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.